If you haven't met me yet, I'm Leah Daragon, and I'm one of the co-founders of Birthroots. So I've been in this space and doing this work for more than 20 years. Birthroots just celebrated its 20th anniversary in 2024. But the nature camp space has been around since 2019, which means our actual toddler programming has only existed for 6-ish years. 6 months out of the year, we have the outdoor classroom, and the other 6 months out of the year, we have a music program. And then year round, we have Emily Murray, who's the other co-founder of Birthroots, does a class called Toddler Parenting. And this new program was Morgan's idea because beginning in 2025, we stopped offering what was called Sprouts. So we had our prenatal classes, our brand new postnatal class called Buds, and then we have the toddler programming. But Sprouts was partly it wasn't filling as a class. Like 1 month it would be overfull, the next month it would be underfull. So it was a little bit wonky. But we realized that one of the things that was going to be missing once we were no longer offering Sprouts was a place where we could have a conversation about milestones. In the Buds class, if you've ever taken that, there's so much to digest and integrate, and you're still sort of in the free fall and you haven't landed with new parenting yet. And that takes a full 12 weeks of just making sense of that new experience. But then once you get in the 3 to 6 month or 3 to 9 month period, you do start having questions about milestones and where are we headed. And we, in Morgan and I's conversation, we started to observe that milestones can be a place of anxiety, a place of lack of clarity. It was just like a kind of a fraught space. So we said, what if there was a session devoted specifically to clearing up some confusion around milestones and bringing sort of just a different mindset or different lens to it. So if you don't mind introducing yourself sort of to each other as much as if you have any, you can use the chat box for this. And at the end, I can read from the chat box. Actually, as we're going through this whole slide deck, there's about 17 slides. If you have questions as we're speaking and you want to type those into the chat box, that would be great and helpful. But us knowing the ages of children that you are thinking about will be particularly helpful. So at first, we were creating a session that was really very focused in on milestones. And then the longer we talked about it, we realized that milestones only really make sense in the light of temperament, because the temperament of one child, their milestone sequence is going to show up differently than a child with a different temperament. And we didn't want to give people more reason to worry. If the way we were describing milestones didn't match your child, it's probably because you have a different temperament child than the one we were particularly describing at that moment. So there were three things, sort of three categories of things we wanted to cover today: milestones, but also the relationship between milestones and temperament, and then the way obsessions and regressions play out in those early years. And then lastly, playful ways to engage that transition from baby to toddler. And so regardless of if you have a child on the baby side of this transition or the older toddler side of this transition, what this milestones conversation is about is that transition from baby to toddler. So if it helps you to really think about that in numbers, some people are comfortable with just sort of a splashy, artistic version of that conversation. But what we're saying is children that are 9 months and younger, we're going to call those babies. And children that are 18 to 36 month olds, we're going to call those toddlers. So anyone in that 9 to 18 month space is in that developmental transition from baby to toddler, which means that if you're parenting and caregiving someone either heading toward that 9 to 18 months or just coming out of that 9 to 18 month window, this is for you. Did I leave anything else out, Morgan, about sort of why we wanted to create this?
No, I don't really think so. I think it's really just to kind of answer questions around, what's typical? Is this normal? What can I expect? How can I support my child through their frustrations when they're trying to achieve some of these milestones? And kind of, what should I expect? What's next? Because there's a lot of like, is this typical? Is this not? And how do we kind of work through that?
Go
So,
ahead, Morgan. Yeah.
We'll just kind of review in general what a milestone is so that we're all kind of on the same page. But milestones are skills that really emerge over time. And so they're kind of foundational. So they form the building blocks for growth and continued learning. Because a lot of times you'll see one skill develop and that skill is kind of needed for the next skill. So for example, pulling to stand, right? A child like really needs to work on pulling themselves up to stand to be able to stand holding on to furniture and then being able to stand in space, right? So it's really that building block. So when we talk about milestones, it's in the age that they're expected to kind of emerge. That statistic is most children. So about 75% of kids will have developed that skill by that age. And milestones are organized into four different categories referred to as domains, which we'll kind of talk about on the next slide. So there's four developmental domains. There's social emotional, language and communication, cognitive, and then movement and physical. So when we think of social emotional, we think of, how is your child interacting with others around them? How are they expressing their needs and wants? So, for example, some milestones that we see in the social emotional category is kind of smiling, playing simple games, like peekaboo, things like that, and having stranger anxiety. This is a big one because a lot of people think that this is kind of atypical. Some of this is temperament, so the intensity of stranger danger or stranger anxiety can be a little bit more related to your child's temperament if they're a little bit more shy and reserved versus a little bit more outgoing. But it is stranger danger is a typical part of development, and it really shows that they have a good attachment to their parents and caregivers, and that they're kind of like, "Ooh, I'm not really that sure about this other person." Right. So the communication domain really looks at how are we able to start to form language, use it, and understand it. So stringing vowels together, those consonant vowel sounds like ma, 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 da, da, da. Using simple gestures, pointing, reaching to kind of indicate their needs and wants. And then when they get older, one of the favorite ones is understood by others 50% of the time. So that's kind of approximately that like 18 to 24-month range. When they're starting to learn communication, people often have a lot of time, like a lot of questions around speech intelligibility. So, how well can my child be understood, their articulation skills? And unless you're the parent or caregiver, typically you'll understand them more, but to a less familiar person who doesn't know them as often, it's really just around 50%. And that's so it's something that I really wanted to point out because a lot of times people are like, oh, where I'm not no one else can understand my kid, or it doesn't sound like that's what they're supposed to be using. But as they're developing, um, they're initially not going to have great intelligibility and great articulation skills, but as they get older, they're able to refine them. And then cognitive. So responding to affection is a big one when they're younger. So, are they giggling or laughing if you tickle them? Are they smiling? If you go to like give them a hug or kiss, do they get excited? Do they reach their arms up in their crib when you go to pick them up because they're excited for you to kind of interact with them? Pointing, understanding, like, oh, I'm trying to show you something. I'm going to point at this object so that we can, interact together. So, like, I'm curious about it. Oh, what is that? Do you want to come explore this with me? Things like that. And then starting to understand no. Doesn't mean they follow it, but starting to understand what the concept of no is. And then motor skills. So that's a lot of times when, people think of milestones. I think motor skills are kind of the most typical that people think about. So those gross motor skills, those big body movements, and those fine motor skills. So how are we kind of using those smaller or fine movement with our hands and eyes together? So rolling is a really common one. So rolling in both directions from your belly to your back and your back to your belly. As kids get a little bit older, stringing beads, so that fine motor coordination of being able to thread the bead on to the string, and then that visual motor coordination of, okay, how do I target the bead and like the hole in the middle of the bead to get through the string? And then climbing on and off furniture. Another kind of area people are like, oh my God, my kid just won't stop climbing on everything. that is typical and that is expected. It's really how they learn how to use how much force to have, how to take risks, and how to take calculated risks versus, I guess, too risky of risks. I don't really have a term for that, but that's what I'd kind of go with. And it also gives them the opportunity to understand how to have that coordination. So coordinate both sides of their body, to use both sides together at the same time and in the same way, but also to be able to coordinate both sides of their body to do something different. For example, like climbing, it's an asymmetrical movement. So this one's kind of really just a visual, and I know it can be a little bit overwhelming, but it's really just kind of a snapshot for some of those typical or kind of more standard milestones that we see with kids. Again, because we're focusing on that 9 to 18-month-old range, we just took a snapshot of that age period from this kind of handout and table. But the nice thing about this summary is that it's really in, kind of clear, concise, caregiver friendly language. So we kind of reviewed some of these, but do some little like big ones because I see that I think it looks like someone's son 8.5 months old, so kind of right on that 9-month-old range, and then 15 months, so kind of closer to that 18-month-old range. For 9 months or kind of emerging into 9 months for motor skills, we're looking at, can they stand holding onto furniture, your leg? Can they sit independently? Are they starting to crawl? Some might be kind of commando crawling, so that army crawl. Some might be crawling onto all fours. Can they get into a sitting position from lying down by themselves? And can they pull themselves to stand? Then we're looking at for like those self-help skills, cognitive skills, are they putting things in their mouth? Again, a very typical skill, and some families have different expectations, and kind of different guidelines about what they want their toddler to put in their mouth versus what other families might not want, and it's really a caregiver decision. So but it's important to understand that that's part of typical development. That's the first way that we're really learning and understanding different things, new things, is to explore it with their mouth. Uh,
One of the things that Morgan and I were observing out in the nature classroom was there would be a set of worries showing up of I'm worried that my toddler's milestones aren't being met over here, while simultaneously there was a set of complaints. I'm like, it's really frustrating that my toddler's always doing this other thing. And we started to have the realization that if people only possess a very narrow understanding of what those milestones are, and they don't realize that this long list of things that you find frustrating are beautiful examples of them actually achieving their milestones, you can worry that they're underperforming while they're actually performing quite well.
Yeah, and I think it also, when we kind of get into the yes zone expectations and kind of some of that like etiquette piece that we talk about, it'll make a lot more sense. But especially putting things in their mouth is one of those things that we see really common, and how it can be perceived really differently by different caregivers. Um, and so really just kind of having that expectation, especially if maybe you're not taking your child yourself or things like that, or you have a nanny or a babysitter, it's also just kind of a great thing to keep in mind. Like, what are your expectations? What are the things that, you kind of value, or I wouldn't even say value, but how do you want to frame that for your child, and just letting other caregivers know so that you're all kind of on the same page. Um, but I think for some of the other kind of 9-month-old milestones that I'll quickly point out, just for the people in the class, would just be having that separation anxiety when a parent's leaving. This is one that we sometimes see, especially if parents or caregivers want to go to the bathroom at nature camp, and we're like, oh, like they leave them with someone else, all of a sudden we'll see some big tears, but that's okay and that's expected. And honestly, it's a beautiful thing because it means that you have a really awesome bonded relationship with your child, and your child really has that trust in you. Um, and then copying sounds of others, trying to copy different things that other kids are doing is a big one that you'll also see as well. And then I'll kind of touch on those 18-month-old, the 12 to 18-month-old, because we have someone who's 15 months, so kind of right smack in the middle. But taking first steps, standing alone, starting to walk, climbing, responding to simple requests. So like, come here, sit down, using simple gestures. So being able to shake your head, yes or no, waving, bye-bye, clapping, starting to point, um, trying to copy some words. And then for those cognitive skills, again, so still crying when a parent leaves, having some favorite toys, showing some fear, sometimes if they're climbing like up the slide or they're climbing up the ladder to go down the slide, being like, oh, I don't know, it looks steep. So starting to kind of develop that one. Um, and then imitating, so more taking things, starting to do some pretend play, pointing, and then as they kind of get older, so pointing to other, identifying their body parts, starting to scribble, starting to try and use utensils to like paint or things like that, recognizing themselves in the mirror, drinking from a cup, which we'll see a lot of in nature camp as well with the little, we have like a sink and a lot of, containers, and a lot of the kids will try and pretend to drink from the cup, or some actually try and drink from the pails instead of the cup. Um, and pointing to pictures and books. We have some books outside there as well. And so that's kind of like a quick little synopsis. So I don't know, it doesn't look like anyone really has any questions in the chat just yet. But it is really kind of important to note someone did say that one of their children is ahead in some areas, in some domains, but then behind in others. And so that's not uncommon to see, especially if there are some challenges in kind of meeting some of these milestones. Sometimes kids will get, it's a fantastic and it's a beautiful thing, and that they've become so well adapted that they've learned to really hone in on the things that they've been successful at, so that they, have mastered some of those other higher skills in some areas while they're still continuing to work on the other areas that are more challenging for them. And so, Leah, do you think I missed anything on that part?
No,
Anything
we're
you want
just moving
to?
into the differentiation between milestones as they're used in a clinical setting versus milestones as they're useful in a caregiving setting. And I think this is where some of the confusion and anxiety crops in is as a clinical tool and as a caregiving tool, they're going to be talked about and thought about kind of differently. So Morgan's going to spend a couple minutes covering how they're used as a clinical tool, and then I'll spend a few minutes talking about how they're used as a caregiving tool.
Yeah, so kind of in the clinical setting, we're looking for, um, you know, is your child meeting these milestones, or is the child that you're caretaking meeting these milestones? And it's really to kind of see, okay, are there some areas of development that they're ahead or behind in? And if they are behind, is there a bigger reason to it, right? Because sometimes delays in milestones can be indicative of other challenges, other like medical challenges or things like that. And sometimes they are truly just some developmental delays for whatever reason, right? It might not have, a bigger underlying cause, but there's developmental delays, and it can be. And that's also where sometimes the temperament of your child comes in. We've seen some kids who are so effective and efficient at crawling that they are like, I can get over there way faster crawling. I don't even want to attempt this walking right now because it's challenging, and I don't really need to because I can still move from here to there in 2 seconds without, fumbling and falling. And I don't want to work on that yet, right? And so that's really where that temperament is. And other kids don't care. It doesn't matter how many times they fall. And they're like, I'm gonna figure this walking thing out. I'm gonna figure this running thing out. And again, so that's kind of sometimes where you see more of those outgoing kids not really care about tumbling, falling, those riskier kids, right? Who might start with some of those motor skills sooner than some of those more reserved kids who might have some of those language skills emerge first, or those, cognitive skills emerge first.
I
But
wish we
really,
had better language for the different temperaments, because there's a specific temperament we see a lot where it's the
yeah.
child, basically the person, who isn't going to show you that they're capable of something until they've mastered it. So it appears that they're delayed in either walking or talking or one of the domains. And then one day they just wake up and they do it with proficiency, and they didn't want to show anybody sort of the behind the scenes practicing of it. That's one of the temperaments, and there are many different temperaments.
And I do, temperaments are such I guess, ambiguous thing to talk about, right? Because there's no specific names for one temperament versus another temperament or kind of those mixed temperaments, but it does play a huge role into some of this milestone development. And especially if you're looking when you're thinking in a group environment, oh, is my child going to show me this here, or are they just going to show me this one-on-one, right? So really it just helps us kind of give an early identification, right? So we're monitoring, doing that developmental surveillance. It helps us identify early, are there delays? What are the causes, if there's a specific cause? And then it facilitates collaboration between parents and caregivers, pediatricians, and then early childhood professionals, right? So whether they're getting early intervention, home health services, at daycare, because some daycare centers have, not just the childcare providers, but other professionals in that sense as well, like actual educators, if they're in more of an educational program versus just like a home daycare as well. So, Leah, do you want to start this one off or you want me to start this one off and then
Go
kind of
ahead. This falls
elaborate?
sort of under
Okay.
the OT domain.
Yeah, no problem. So that initial piece, that developmental surveillance or developmental monitoring is really kind of, so who does that, right? You guys as caregivers. So you're kind of looking for those simple developmental milestones, right? We don't need, and this is where it's important to know some of those bigger developmental milestones, but it doesn't mean that you need to sit there and write down exactly every single milestone, know exactly how old they were when they achieved that skill, and kind of know every single milestone, right? And I think that's sometimes where we get that stressful point for caregivers. And it's really just about noticing them and paying attention to them, monitoring them, and noticing kind of a trend. Are we still steadily making gains? Are we kind of plateauing? Things like that. Because that information is going to be really important for when you go to your pediatrician, because your pediatrician typically does some regular developmental screens at your well child visits, right? So there's typically well child visits at 9, 18, and 30 months of age. Sometimes they'll do a 15-month, sometimes they'll do a 24-month. Well, they'll also do the developmental screening. It kind of depends on your pediatrician. But oftentimes that developmental screening that gets used in a pediatrician's office is the ASQ. So a lot of times they'll have you fill out the ASQ either before your visit or during your visit. And so that's a developmental screening, right? It's that kind of in between, and it looks at the developmental milestones, but it helps kind of catch that early identification. Okay, is there something that maybe we should look into a little bit more to see if there are true developmental delays, um, or are we kind of right on track, right? And then depending on how that conversation goes, you may have a developmental evaluation, and that is like your pediatrician would send a referral to, kind of depends, early intervention, PT, OT, home health, depending on the age and other kind of health aspects of your child, I would say. And they will do like a full developmental evaluation, a standardized assessment to identify, are there developmental delays, and other conditions. And that's when there's really a concern. Okay, that doesn't seem like we're making a lot of progress with our milestones, or it looks like we plateaued, or we're not hitting a good chunk. Kind of the rule of thumb as a clinician is about meeting between 50 to 75% of the milestones for that age group is kind of typical, right? Because not every kid develops differently. Every kid achieves their milestones differently, and those are really just kind of an age range, right? We're not expecting every single thing to be met by that certain age. It's a spectrum. And so one of those things, so the developmental screening and evaluations can be done. Um, every state, so it's a federal requirement all over the US. Every state needs to have an early intervention program. And each state is in charge of their own early intervention program. So in Maine, it's called Early Intervention for Me. Right now it's through Child Development Services, but they're kind of branching off to be their own entity for early intervention now. So that's why they're renaming it to Early Intervention for Maine. There's a website. It's actually at the bottom, and I think we're gonna send out like a email after with the website just so you guys have it for your reference and stuff. But you guys can always go onto that website. There's a self-referral, which is a really cool thing. So if you're feeling concerned about your child's development, um, you can actually self-refer and ask for the early intervention team to come out to your house and do a evaluation for your child. Your pediatrician can also refer, but this is kind of where sometimes that advocacy, if you're feeling like you're not really heard, because sometimes that happens, right? We go and our concerns are kind of dismissed. I, I really hope that that's not the case, but it does happen. So it's nice to know that there is something that you can do if you're feeling like, oh, my concerns aren't really being heard, and I just, I want to check on this. You can self-refer through the website. There's different regions, for basically the different counties in the state. So the team that will come out is the one that's associated with the region, which is based off of where you live. But it's for kids birth through 3. So the last day that they're eligible for early intervention is the day before they turn 3. Um, and it really is early childhood professionals coming into the home, doing the evaluation if they qualify for services, really working with you guys to figure out, hey, what are your areas of concern? What are the things that are really important to you as a family and that you want your child to achieve, and how can we help you meet those goals?
Before we move on to the caregiving tool, I just really do appreciate that in the state of Maine, parents can self-refer. And just noting that early intervention goes right up until they turn 3, and then it's a different system. What's the second system called, Morgan?
So it's through Child Development Services right now. We're kind of Maine's at a weird standpoint right now, because they were the only state in the nation that did it differently. But also per federal guidelines, once they turn 3, it's under free and appropriate, accessible education, basically. So it goes into the education. Early intervention is still part of the education system, but once they turn 3, it's the school districts, because then that's when public preschool starts and things like that. So the school district handles, and it's specialized into like OTPT speech, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And I think that sort of speaks to the value of having access to opportunities, whether it be the music program at Birth Roots, the nature camp program at Birth Roots, or just any way that you get to be out in the community, even if it's just going to the library time for toddlers. So you can get a sense of your child being somewhere on that map where some children similar age to your child are doing some of those developmental milestones ahead or behind, and your child is ahead or behind. So you can see where it's not like a straight line, that it's not like 2 dots in a line crossing. It's that children will work on one developmental milestone somewhat obsessively while a different child is working on a different milestone somewhat obsessively. So it's helpful to be around other families with similar age children. So we're shifting the conversation a little bit away from the segment that was about if you are having concerns, if you are looking for resources and support, that is what the local system will look like for you. But we didn't want people to sort of have this idea that your child's milestones are like an on-off button. Either they're happening or they're not happening, and you're just sort of sitting around waiting to see them and observe them with, but that it's like an ecosystem, and there's a cause and effect of engaging and playing, and there are fun little games that children love to do that act like nursery rhymes where you bounce them on your knee or touch their toes that awaken and sort of beckon those milestones to come alive. So we wanted to talk about how would a caregiver, as opposed to a clinical person, think about milestones? So 3 thoughts for today include adults equipped with more detailed understanding of toddler development and how to engage and support it are far less frustrated and tend to be more attuned. So when a caregiver has that big picture of how many developmental tasks toddlers are achieving and working on, obsessing on, and regressing on, they tend to bring that bigger picture to a place of less frustration, more patience, and it feels easier to actually take care of a toddler when you can see that bigger picture. Additionally, caregivers who learn playful ways to respond to emerging milestones, regressions, and obsessions tend to have more confidence and more positive rapport with their child. So when you're not sitting there feeling like, oh no, am I doing something wrong? Is my child doing something wrong? And you can kind of relax into like, oh, here's a perfectly normal thing for a toddler to do. It allows you to have a little bit of levity about the situation. And that's that sort of rapport of like, I said we weren't going to do that. So you can bring that lightheartedness instead of that sort of clenched place of, oh no, I hope something's not wrong. I hope I'm not, their worries are very normal for parents, especially when this is your first child. And so hopefully one of the takeaways from today is giving you that sense of like, here's what a caregiving role in engaging milestones can include. And so while information about milestones is helpful, information alone, especially out of context and without support, can actually be stressful for parents who are isolated. And so that was really the point of intervention that we wanted to address in this session. So maybe you do, or maybe you don't know about cycles of obsession and aggression with toddlers, but toddlers, I mean, most children probably through age 7, a lot of what we're talking about while we're focused in somewhat on 9 to 18 months is true for children up until that sort of age of reason kicks in around 7. But they tend to do things in an obsessive way, which can be exhausting if you are a primary caregiver and that caregiving is 24/7 and you have someone who is obsessively wanting to practice stairs or obsessively wanting to hear what their voice can do really loud or obsessively wanting to throw their food or throw toys. It can be exhausting. So we just wanted to name and give language to obsession and regression is part of that achieving milestones. And that while they're obsessing on one thing, they're often ignoring another thing. And that's where those regressions show up. And those regressions can be a source of worry for some parents and caregivers. So just the opportunity to open up the conversation that we don't need to pathologize either the obsession end of it nor the aggression end of it. More to add to that, Morgan?
Yeah, I just think it's kind of one of those things where a new skill, anything novel is super exciting, right? It's kind of like having a novel toy. I just want to play with that toy. Like, this is super cool. I haven't seen it before. It's kind of the same with these skills. Like, oh, I didn't know my body could do that. This is super cool. And I want to master it, right? The way that we get better at things is repeated practice and repeated exposure. And so that's really where we see this kind of obsession happen. And then that regression that we see sometimes, it isn't really true regression, but it's a sense of like, oh, my child has been really wanting to do the stairs, right? And all of a sudden now I'm not seeing them kick the ball nearly as much. Like, so you might not see that. And then all of a sudden, when they have mastered the stairs, they're going to start kicking the ball again, right? And that's really because their brain only has so much space. They are working on so many things all at once. Their brains are fantastic, but they still have the capacity, right? And so that's sometimes why you see the other skills that they have previously mastered, you don't see them doing as much while they're learning something new, but it doesn't mean that they've lost them. And, that true regression is if, they had multiple skills and then they lost multiple skills and you didn't see them reemerge, right? But that's kind of, I liked the idea of where Leah was calling it that ignoring regression, right? Kind of, you're like, oh, did you lose that? But then the next day, all of a sudden, they're kicking the ball again. And you're like, oh, okay. You were just really wanting to learn that new skill.
There's also something called fluctuating capacity, which we definitely have as adults. But in your newborn baby, you might have experienced this morning you knew how to feed, and now this afternoon you seem to have forgotten how to transfer milk. And it's just a true, like, where we have different levels of energy and attention throughout a day or a week. We, as even adults, can have obsession regression cycles around what we're feeling good at, what we're feeling insecure about, as well as our children, even in our parenting. So, this is where we get to have a much more in-depth conversation about different temperaments. And the temperaments that we're going to focus on more specifically have to do with styles of sensory processing. Whether you're a toddler or a grown-up, some people want a whole lot more of one kind of sensory input and are not interested or even kind of overwhelmed by other kinds of sensory input. And so right now, you are in a time of getting to know which person came to live with you. Are they the sort of person who likes to rub yogurt in their hair because they just want to not just taste the yogurt, but like feel it? Or are they the sort of person who quickly puts their hand over their ears when they hear a loud noise? So you're going to be realizing that we weren't all handed the same child, and each child has so many different aspects to their temperament. So their milestone progression is going to show up differently based on some differences in temperament. One of the languages that we use a lot at birth roots and in the nature camp has to do with whether a child is more sensory seeking or sensory reserved. And so one little test you can find out about some of your child's sensory diet needs is when you go to a playground and there's a baby swing that's appropriate for the age of your child, and you put them in the swing, or maybe you have a swing at home and you go to push them on the swing. Do you have the child who's like, more, underdog, do it harder, do it faster? That's one kind of temperament. Or do you have the child who you go to push the swing and they're like, that's enough, don't do it any harder. And so just making these observations of your child and sharing those observations with others who care for them, not in a way to label them as it's not for the purpose of pegging them in or boxing them in as a certain type of person, but just if someone else were to care for your child, knowing that this particular child is like surfing the mosh pit or just wants to touch one little thing and that's enough. I was recently at the Maine Maple Sunday event, and there was a farm, and there was some sheep in a pen, and there were two toddlers. They appeared to both be like 20 to 24 months old, and one toddler was like sticking his arm all the. I mean, I think he wanted his hand in the sheep's mouth. He just wanted to have a sensory experience of that sheep, and the other toddler was standing like 3 feet back, and the adult was like, do you want to get a little closer? And they were like, nope, I'm experiencing the sheep as much as I need to experience the sheep. And so gaining some confidence around, oh, I happen to have a toddler who is more reserved or more seeking. Anything else about that, Morgan?
I think really, again, it's not about putting them in a box, but it really is when you kind of can tune into your child in that sense, or the child that you're caregiving for, it kind of makes both of your lives easier. Not that parenting or caregiving is easy in any way, shape, or form, but knowing how your child and observing how they may respond kind of gives you the tools to be like, oh, now I kind of know how to respond to them in that, or I can make sure to have things available that will help them. So, for example, if your child is the one who like does not want the yogurt all over their face or their hands, like making sure that there's a spoon for them, or making sure that there's something that they can still experience it, but in a way that's comfortable for them. Same thing with loud noises. Sometimes, like teaching your child, oh, you can put your hands over your ears, or oh, there's headphones, or things like that. Like there, it really helps so that you can still do things as a family or kind of as a unit, but you're able to kind of meet your child where they're at so that it's a better experience for both of you, right? Because there's nothing worse than, being out and your child's having a meltdown. And again, totally developmentally appropriate and normal. And so if we can kind of expect that and we have some of those tools to help them kind of cope, because we can't always control the sensory environment and the world around us, but we can adapt and respond to it. And so having those tools in your toolbox of, okay, what works best for my child or the child I'm caregiving so that I'm prepared and can help support them through these times that may be challenging is only going to give you some more confidence and your child some more confidence in those more challenging times.
It also helps to have this language in relationship to your extended family or your friends. It can be challenging to a friendship if you have, on the spectrum from reserved to sensory seeking. Someone might be an extreme example of one or the other, or they might kind of hang out in the middle. And if you and your best friend have similar age children, and one of you has an extreme, reserved, and one of you has an extreme seeking, it can make play dates awkward. But if having this language and not trying to make one child right or one child wrong, but just these are different places in that sensory diet requests can be empowering for sure. Morgan, do you want to take this one?
Sure. So there's kind of three main types of play that we start to see in this age group. So really kind of gearing more towards that like 9 month, we see that onlooker play, right? So, and it can be with other kids of similar age, like 9 months old, or even kids older. And it can also be with adults. It's really when they're kind of sitting and they are looking and observing the environment around them. And this starts in infancy, right? So, when they're sitting in their swing or they're doing tummy time or they're hanging out on your chest or things like that, and they're starting to lift their head and look around and explore the environment visually. That's a type of play, and that's really called onlooker play. And it's really how, they start to make these observations and they see what other people are doing, what the environment is doing. They're starting to kind of figure out how do things work? Can I get my body to move like that? Or what are they doing, right? It really provides a good foundation for that cognitive piece. So some of those cognitive skills, for those social emotional skills, those language skills, and those motor skills in the sense of, oh, my body can do that. How am I going to experiment with my body to make my body do that? How am I going to scoop and dump things? How am I going to eventually crawl? Oh, I want to go reach that toy. How am I going to get to it? Oh, it looks like they're crawling or, they're pulling themselves to stand. So then we kind of hit that parallel play, and this is more so what we see geared to that like 15 to 18-month-old range, even that 2-year-old range. So it's really when kids are sitting next to each other and playing next to each other, but not really interacting during their play, right? So in this picture, they both have shovels and pails and they're in the dirt, right? And they're both kind of scooping and experimenting with the shovels and the pails by themselves, but they're not doing anything together or working together for towards a common goal. They may sometimes in parallel play, you'll start to see like trading of a shovel or like a pail or things like that. But it's not like they're scooping and filling one pail together or they're trying to build a castle or anything like that. That's more geared to that collaborative play, and that's really a lot older than we expect. And I think that that's a really important thing to point out because this is something that I think we have an expectation for it to emerge a lot earlier than it really does. And this is really like 3, 4, 5, and 3 is really just like that emerging age of collaborative play. Sometimes you'll see it a little bit earlier, but most of the time it's more adult facilitated than anything else. But that true collaborative play is really like more youth, like 4 or 5, and it's when they're doing like, working together for a common goal. So, a game like Ring Around the Rosie, where an adult's not facilitating it, or they're trying to build a tower together, or they're starting to do some like they're playing like house, but they're doing it together, right? Things like that. That's a really great example of collaborative play. They're working together towards a common goal.
So, I love that the two families that are here are right in that transition from baby to toddler. We're looking for clues about a child's temperament and tendencies, and we want to have a conversation about being more both accepting and responsive to different temperaments and different sensory needs. So you might have cousins or, like I said, your best friend's child. And so being part of a group of toddlers can feel hard or challenging because it's sort of natural to compare like how's my child doing, but rather than thinking the one dimensional of just milestones, making those observations around different temperaments, different sensory diets, and really trusting the tempo of the child. That's a really strong message in the nature camp space is if a child enters a space, whether that's a space called a family gathering of a barbecue or a museum, whatever the space is, if you have the toddler who wants to turn their face and hide their face into your body, and we don't have to second guess that tempo and sort of push them into the new activity. We can move slowly and wait for them to be ready to peek with just one eye. If it's kind of taking a little bit of time, you could be like, oh, let's look at something very far away, like not the sheep 2 feet away, but like way over there. So there's just playful ways that we can first recognize the temperament or sensory diet of our child, and then be a little playful with it. Similarly, if you have that opposite end of the spectrum child who's going to come into a space and kind of overwhelm other people with the bigness of their personality, you can engage them initially when you first arrive there, where maybe you do a walkabout the perimeter, or maybe you name a bunch of options that exist. So you sort of absorb some of that big energy initially until they settle in. So it's obvious to us that a child who's hiding their face could use a couple minutes to settle into the space of what's going on. But that child who's being huge in their energy is also doing a transition and could use a little, maybe a little bit of a helper around that transition, someone who's relaxed about the fact that that transition might look that way and can be a little bit playful in it, of like hiding something and finding it, so that some of that energy doesn't come at other toddlers, because sometimes at that age, other toddlers are just another feature in the new environment, and we want to help our toddler be successful at making that transition into that new space. What are some other clues that we observe, Morgan?
I think the tendency to kind of run away as well. Sometimes all of a sudden they'll be playing, everything looks like it's going well, and there's like tears and they are running away, and you're like, what just happened? They don't really have the not they don't really. They don't have the capacity to recognize those internal cues to feel I'm getting overwhelmed, right? And so it's kind of our job as parents and caregivers to sometimes notice these cues and facilitate, okay, how can we work on regulating our body, right? And so sometimes when you kind of have that kid who all of a sudden just drops something and runs away, it's like, I mean, I was either getting too overwhelmed. So it's really important to notice, like, okay, was there, say you have the more sensory reserved child, did another child go down the slide and like scream super excitedly, and your sensory reserved child was right next to them, and all of a sudden they're like, I am out of here. Like that just set me over the edge. I need a break. I need some space. Or sometimes you may have the kid that all of a sudden, we see tears. And maybe you weren't looking like right there, right that second. It was because a toddler, they were both in the sand pit and someone knocked down whatever they had just built, right? So sometimes some of these are ways that some kids don't care that their tower got knocked down. They may think it's funny. That might be the end of the world to another toddler. So really sometimes recognizing these things is it's really important, because though recognizing kind of the interplay that other external factors have on our body's internal responses is super important, because your job as a parent and a caregiver is to help the child that you're with kind of work through understanding those internal responses and responding to them in an appropriate way. And when I say an appropriate way, it doesn't mean, like facilitating that sorry and sharing necessarily, but just how can we kind of get our body back to baseline and really kind of be in that good in between where we're feeling good, we're feeling okay. How do we get ourselves back to regulate, like a regulated state?
Mm. So we're about to wrap up in here if you have questions or we want clarification on anything. But the big takeaways from today are remembering the difference between a clinical and a caregiving lens on milestones. And these are sort of two conversations brought into one. If you look down sort of at the bottom bullet point here, having friendships and connection with other adults who get it about toddlers, who neither pathologize normal toddler behavior nor are minimizing your concerns. Nobody wants to, if they bring up a concern, have everyone be like, "Oh, it's normal. They'll grow out of it. It's fine." When you're actually like, "Well, I mean, I'm having concerns. I want to talk about it." So, two things can often happen, and we're just naming them. People can say there's a problem with your child when they're just being normal, or you can think maybe there's a struggle here, or we need some help, and they're like, "No, no, it's fine." So finding your self-advocacy, if you're feeling like you have people in your sphere who are pressuring you in either direction, can be helpful. So a couple of things we're going to remember to do is making space for the current obsessions. First, acknowledge, like, if right now climbing is your, actually, if you want to put in the chat box what some current obsessions of your child are right now, we can talk about them in a minute. So whether it's climbing up the stairs or throwing food or yelling or pulling on an animal, if we can be like, okay, clearly this is an obsession, and how can I find positive outlets for that obsession? Because it might not be that the obsession or the thing they're doing is a problem. It's just a problem in this setting, or it's a problem under these circumstances. So finding settings and circumstances where it's not a problem, and playing it cool with those regressions, knowing they're part of a cycle, for an amount of time before, and then if they persist or there's more than one regression, you can do the things we set in motion earlier in the slide. Um, and that idea of creating yes zones, just to clarify, a yes zone isn't because we don't want to say no to our child. And there's no such thing as a 100% yes zone. It's just finding, like I said a moment ago, circumstances and settings where their current obsession isn't a problem. So if dumping water out of the dog's bowl is making you crazy, you can pause and be like, okay, dumping water is the obsession. Is dumping water inherently problematic? No, but dumping the dog's water on the kitchen floor is definitely problematic. So we're going to find a zone in our yard or our house or somewhere where dumping water, dumping water, dumping water obsessively is celebrated and enjoyed. Um, what else would you add to this slide, Morgan, that I might not have covered?
Really, it's just kind of our role, especially in the milestone aspect with kind of parenting and caregiving, is setting up opportunities and environments and experiences for your child to practice some of these skills and do activities that will help facilitate their milestones and meet them where they're at. So it's kind of like that just right challenge piece, right? The activity or whatever it is might be slightly challenging, but not so challenging that they're like, I don't want anything to do with this. I'm not even going to try. I'm going to get too frustrated. I'm not even going to entertain the idea. Or things that are too easy that's like, oh, they've completely mastered it. So now we're just stuck on that one thing, right? So it's really finding that balance. And I think play is your best friend. Making things playful, making things funny, being silly, um, is goes so far. Um, it kind of helps take some of the stress off of you as the caregiver, and it takes some of the stress out of the situation because you and the child that you're kind of caregiving for, it's a dynamic interplay. They kind of can feed off of your stress and vice versa, right? So really kind of remembering that our other role as a caregiver is trying to be that model of a regulated person, and how can you facilitate regulation in your child is going to go so far. And I think kind of looking in the chat, some of these are really typical kind of regressions of sessions, things like that. Throwing food is huge. So one of my things, a playful activity for that is like going to the park and getting some bread and letting them throw the bread to like the ducks or whatever. Um, Something like super fun and turning that into a creative yes, like, oh, it looks like, you're trying to big one if people have pets is like throwing food for the dog. Oh, like we can't throw food for the dog right now, but we could go to the park and, throw bread for the dogs or whatever. Where it's a creative yes and a creative no at the same time. It's not quite as triggering. Crawling can be so challenging, right? Making fun opportunities, going to the playground to practice like crawling up the stairs. That's a really great one to encourage crawling because it's a combination of like pulling yourself to stand, but also trying to pull yourself forwards. Um, Crawling over like different obstacles, really just thinking about how can I kind of change it up to make it fun, to make it different so that they're not trying to do the same thing all the time and it be a point of tension and not be fun anymore for them to try and do. And it really kind of goes nicely into this next, what is the most important question? I'll let Leah take that.
Hmm. So, I want to visit the word play and playful for just a minute. I know a lot of adults, parents who are like, I don't love playing. I'm not very playful. And I want to make a distinction between being your child's playmate and being a silly caregiver. So I'm not saying you should get down on the floor with the cars and go vroom, 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 vroom. Like that's not what I mean by playful necessarily. What I mean is finding where the laughter is in this human experience and being that developmental phase and So the three like they're universal because every child across the globe, it doesn't matter what language they speak, what culture they grow up in, there are three ways to be playful with children that start with peekaboo, that move to mature into hide and seek, and mature into tag or chasing and catching. And so sometimes when our children's behavior is whiny and they're not their best self, you're not your best self, introducing one of the peekaboo, hide and seek, or I'm going to get you. And often we're giving too small of a dose. So we do it for 2 minutes and we need to do it for 20 minutes. Or maybe we need to invite another adult in. Like, can you do 20 minutes of hide and seek? Because I've been caregiving 24/7. But the idea that you can increase the dosage of time in one of those three games or the dosage of silliness. So you can up the ante of silliness around peekaboo or hide and seek by having wildly different facial expressions or children are much older. A lot of these things, their children are much older than you would think when you could play a hot and cold game. That's like post 2 years old, more like 3 or 4. But finding ways to be like, I'm gonna chase you to try to get your socks off, or you can invite a stuffed animal into the hide and seek game where they hide the stuffed animal and you as the adult, you want to add some silliness around not really knowing how to win at the game or whatever. So maybe the stuffed animal is hiding in plain sight and you're lifting up all kinds of things, not able to find it, and your toddler is laughing and laughing. And so I always like to remind people, do you prefer laughter or do you prefer crying? Because toddlers need to get that energy out of their body either through crying or through laughter. So you can invite them into a game that gets them belly laughing so hard they can hardly catch their breath, or you can hold them while they have a tantrum. But either way, it's energy in the body that's just getting out. So
Mhm.
um, those are some those are my favorite three examples of playful ways. I also like to do little like body. I'll give the example of like the itsy bitsy spider climbing up the
Mhm.
body of the child and then the rain falling down the body of the child. Anything that's like two people, like not toys per se, not that toys are bad, but when it's just two people like um, I'm holding you tight and you can't get away, but you let them win kind of stuff. How about you, Morgan? Do you have some favorite go-tos for playful
Funny voices.
funny voices?
Whether you're changing like the tone of your voice, the inflection of your voice, like your actual imitating voices of characters, things like that, that usually is like a big go-to for us. Animal walk. So like, can you hop like a bunny? Let's stomp like a dinosaur. Those are huge ones that can be really helpful during some of those challenging transitions. And I really just like to think of kind of the distinction of playfulness and play. Playfulness is more of a relationship characteristic, I like to say, than like an activity in and of itself. Like when I think of playing, I think of stacking blocks with your toddler or driving cars, and those things are important and there is a time and a place, but kind of having that distinction of you can still be a playful parent, but you're not always their playmate. You could still set those boundaries. You can try and make, your household or however you want to call it more of a yes zone so they have those opportunities, but still having those boundaries.